Communities across South Africa have been embarking on protests, raising a lack of service delivery as one of their main issues. Amnesty International says the protests ahead of elections are a sign of people's discontent with the failure of political parties to deliver on their promises. We're joined in studio now by Meinke Steytler from Amnesty International South Africa. Meinke, thank you so much for your time. Now, having seen some of the recent protests in South Africa, in particular, Alex, and having watched that clip, we know at the center of these service delivery protests are basic human rights needs by South Africans. Why do you think that the voice of the poor remains unheard, unless obviously it's for the benefit of those that are in power, essentially?
Exactly. Amnesty International really feels very strongly about this. It was Alex, but every morning that we wake up, and we all know this in South Africa, there's another service delivery protest. It's been spreading. People really are unhappy, and so close to the polls. It's people's way of expressing their discontent, as you said, and yes, they're basic human rights. So what we call them are economic, social and cultural rights. So it's keeping those, the right to education, the right to health, the right to adequate housing, the right to sanitation, just having running water or electricity are just basic things that people need to live lives of dignity. And it appears to us that 25 years on, this is still not being listened to, or listened to enough, or urgently enough. And so the call that we're making is saying that, okay, great, we're going to go to the polls, the government-elect will come into power, and now is the time to take this seriously. But the thing that is big for us is also there's a lot of summits, a lot of forums, a lot of talk that happens. A lot of politicians go on television and say, oh yes, we're going to do this, this, this. Oh, we're going to go to Alex and talk to the community members. And then 4 years down the line, 5 years down the line, to the next election, we've still seen no change. And some of these protests, ebb and wane and maybe go back to a bit more peaceful. And then we see it again. And we're saying we need concrete action plans that will be implemented with the proper resources also given to those action plans. And organizations like ours, but it's not only us, it's other organizations as well that are working on the ground, will keep the government to hold them to account on this.
Now, before we go into those solutions post-elections, let's take a look at these protests, these recent protests. What do you think is at the core of these latest protests? Do you think it's just a case of, and again, looking at Alex and Philippe in the Western Cape and those other communities? Alex, as we speak, is literally burning. What do you think is at the center of these service delivery protests? Is it better service delivery? Or is it a case of citizens being tired of corruption?
I think it's a combination, actually. The inequality in our country is literally getting worse as opposed to better. And it is also people feeling that they're not listened to year after year after year after year. Before 1994, they weren't listened to because that is the way that the government of those days was structured. And now they still don't feel listened to. And they will tell our researchers on the ground that the reason they burn things, the reason they take the action they do, is because it's the only way they feel they get attention, maybe, and someone might come and see them. And so it is that they're tired of corruption, but I think it's also that they're tired of surviving day to day for things that the government should be supplying and should be giving, as part of running the country, and that they're just sick and tired of it. And I think a lot of people are feeling that they're now expected to vote, but what are they voting for? And that's what is fueling all of this.
All right, some people obviously saying that at the center of holding these leaders accountable is voting for better leaders. Do you think citizens understand this, and do you think that they will necessarily come out in their numbers to vote to make that change for themselves? Because they have been saying in most communities, in some of these protests, that they will not be voting, in fact.
It is sad when one hears that people won't be voting because it is how they can give their voice. But I think also year in and year out, yes, to be told to vote for better leaders is one thing, but are we being shown the leadership that we really need as a country? Are these communities in particular who are really living on the forefront, on the edge of the inequality, are they being given the leadership that they can vote for in the first place? And people who stand for, political positions and who put themselves forward as leaders need to think very, very strongly about human rights, and they need to think very strongly about what their agenda and what their reasons are for going into, politics. And it's about serving the people. And I think people don't feel served. And telling them to vote for better leadership is easier said than done, because people don't actually know who to vote for in the first place for better leadership. So what parties should show is what are they going to do about these basic human rights? What are they, and they can't just stand there and make promises and promises and promises and not deliver on them, because then they will lose votes and then people will stop voting.
Now, as Amnesty International, you've obviously been on the ground. You've spoken to some South Africans that are disgruntled, some of them desperately needing to see change. What are they saying is at the heart of their frustration? Because, you mentioned that they don't know who to vote for. Surely, with more education, with a little bit of insight in terms of, what kind of political party needs to lead the country. This is a political party that would do X, Y, and Z. What are some of the things that, as Amnesty International, are doing to try and maybe educate the general public?
So something that we do is what we call human rights education, and we also do human rights friendly schools. So we go into schools in these areas, we set up human rights clubs, because what we found is that yes, there are a lot of people, especially community leaders, are very well versed in what their human rights are. But now and again you find that people don't actually realize that that leaders are obligated to deliver on these human rights, things like education, housing, the right to health. The list goes on. And we find that when we can start equipping people from especially a young age, that they can actually demand their rights. Of course, we are a non-violent organization, so we don't promote violence at all. We rather promote engagement and how you can do that, and you must make sure you know who your MP is of your local area or who your local community leader is, and engage with that person or persons. So we try to really encourage that as well. But the core thing that we try to do is just that people understand that this is actually an obligation, this is a duty of the government, and that the people are not there to serve the government, as we have seen with a lot of the corruption going on, but that actually the government is there to serve the people. And you find that once you get people to understand that, they take ownership of what the challenges are in their specific areas, and that's some very exciting work that we're seeing. Obviously, we always say human rights is a sprint, not a marathon. So it doesn't obviously mean that once someone snaps that the right to basic education is actually an obligation, that it happens overnight. But what we really feel hopeful about is that people become better and better versed as expressing themselves towards leaders, whoever's in control of that area, that they have an obligation and a duty to fix a school or fix the water supply or give better healthcare services.
All right, so now we know that South Africa as a country is obligated through the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to report on how it's doing in the economic, social and cultural rights of South Africans. And in fact, that they have reported to the UN's Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and that report was in fact handed over at the end of 2018.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is contained in that report in terms of South Africa's role?
Yes, so we, as a country, we ratified. So what that means is we basically signed the covenant in 2015, which then signed us up to a whole lot of obligations which look at things like the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing, and so forth. And yes, towards the end of last year, all countries are reviewed by the committee, and South Africa was reviewed. And just as an example, education, for example. So the committee completely understood that great progress has been made. We definitely have more people going to school. We definitely have more access. There's a lot of things that you also see more matriculants matriculating, more people going to university. But the recommendations that they also made was, for example, under the covenant, schooling, basic education, that's primary and secondary education, should be free. And schools should be providing this with, of course, the budget from the state. It should be a free service. What researchers are finding, and this is not only Amnesty, this is fantastic organizations like Equal Education, Section 27, what they're finding is that people are actually having to pay hidden costs, often, people, and that actually means that a lot of people drop out because they cannot continue paying. They have to, rather work than go to school. And one of the main recommendations that the committee made was that South Africa has to take this very seriously and look at how it can stop that from happening. And also looking at infrastructure, that was another recommendation that came up, looking at the number of pit latrines. And we know that President Ramaphosa did talk about this in his State of the Nation address. And we know that there is a plan, but we want to see, obviously, in a year's time, we want to make sure that the number of pit latrines has been significantly reduced. And the UN is recommending that as well, that schools are fixed properly, that they're maintained properly, and that the government puts a plan in place that also allocates resources in a better way. So some schools need less resources than other schools, and some provinces less than others, and that this is really looked at in a serious sense, and the way funding and budgeting is done, so that we can really fix each school infrastructure-wise, but also obviously the quality of education that kids are getting there. And that's just an example of many within the report.
Now, a report is all good and well, but who actually manages and polices that report and makes sure that actually those promises are done? Now, I want you to answer that question equally with the statement that you made earlier on in this interview, where you said that in order for us to see these protests starting to diminish, you need leaders to be held accountable. Now, what are some of those, ideas that you have post-election to deal with some of these crises that we are seeing now in this country, where people have to, as a final resort, literally burn their houses just to be heard?
Yes, exactly. So this is where a strong civil society and a free media actually comes in very strongly. And that's because civil society, so again, Amnesty International, we're a big international NGO. There are civil society organizations on the ground in South Africa that have been working on these issues for years. In fact, the submission that these organizations made, because people can make submissions to the UN regarding all these economic, social, cultural right issues, was done as a team as well. So one of the ideas we've had as well is to have a scorecard, and actually to make sure that as each year goes by, we actually check, okay, education, what is the progress there? Healthcare, what is the progress? For example, the NHI, what is the progress that's been made on that? Housing, what is the progress been made on that? But civil society organizations within it cannot do it alone. It's a team effort. And again, the media plays a huge role in this. And that's why it's important that we always fight for a free media, because the media must also say, you know what, it's not good enough that there's still children dying in pit latrines. It's not good enough. And with civil society, that's how we keep leaders to account. And if leaders come out and say something on television or in a public statement that is found, that is known to be incorrect, that is also very clearly communicated to communities and to the country as a whole, and in that way, hopefully, holding them to account. But in particular, looking at if they make statements like, we will reduce the number of pit latrines by 1,000 by next year. Next year, have they actually done this? And we need to make sure that we go to Parliament and say, have you done this? Show us the records.
All right, very quickly before we wrap up, how do we empower the citizen? Because at the moment they feel that their voice is not heard, that come election time, that's the only opportunity they will get leaders to finally listen to them. But throughout the year, how do we make sure that they can be heard and they are empowered? How do we make sure that they know about, organizations such as yourselves or those that are locally in their areas?
That's why it's so important that there were people like us who sit in the office office and work, but that we go into these communities, that we meet in particular with who are the leaders there, who are the church leaders, the other religious leaders, the community leaders, people who are fighting for certain issues, for example, women's rights. And we really build good and trusted relationships with these people and also give them the information, support, capacity building that they need. Because ultimately, we want them to take ownership of it and know that they have a democratic right and a right to freedom to go to government and make submissions or come to see us if we're making a submission and tell us what's going on in their communities. And that's how we want to empower them. But what's important is to always make sure that our civil society remains healthy, that it remains corruption-free, and that it remains people-focused, and that people can hear about organizations like ours, but also our partner organizations that we work with.
All right, fantastic, Meinke. Thank you so much. That's where we have to leave it. All right, that was Amnesty International South Africa's Media and Digital Content Officer, Meinke Steytler.